Mission Ranch Restaurant, nestled along the Carmel coastline, possessed a timeless, peaceful beauty. The golden hues of the setting sun painted the gray stone walls, further embellishing the vibrant bougainvillea trellises. The rhythmic crashing of waves served as a soothing melody, calming the souls of all who entered. Sarah, a young waitress with chestnut-brown hair and bright blue eyes, moved swiftly between the tables, a smile constantly gracing her lips. She loved this job, loved the warm, friendly atmosphere of Mission Ranch. But deep down, Sarah was always worried about the upcoming rent. The meager salary from her serving job wasn't enough to cover the expensive cost of living in Carmel. She dreamed of one day opening a small bakery, where she could unleash her creativity with sweet treats. But that dream seemed too far away. As the clock struck 6, the restaurant began to fill. Laughter, lively conversations, and the clinking of glasses created a joyful symphony. Suddenly, the door opened, and a middle-aged man entered. His name was Mark, and his face clearly displayed arrogance and conceit. Mark donned an expensive suit, his hair slicked back and shiny, but the look in his eyes lacked warmth. He surveyed the room with a critical gaze, as if judging everyone present. Sarah instinctively felt uneasy, but she shook it off, attributing it to her general anxiety about finances. She reminded herself to focus on providing excellent service and earning good tips. Little did she know, Mark's arrival heralded a storm that would soon shatter the tranquility of Mission Ranch. The peaceful ambiance of the evening was about to be disrupted by a display of arrogance and a test of courage. Mark seated himself at a table near the window, snapping his fingers impatiently to get Sarah's attention. "Waitress, I'm parched. Get me a bottle of your finest Cabernet. And make it snappy," he barked, his voice laced with entitlement. Sarah approached his table, forcing a smile. "Certainly, sir. I'll be right back with that." As she returned with the wine, Mark peppered her with questions that felt increasingly personal and intrusive. "How long have you been working here? You look awfully young. Still in school, I presume?" Sarah politely answered, trying to maintain a professional demeanor. "A few months, sir. I'm saving up for something." Mark chuckled, a condescending sound that grated on Sarah's nerves. "Saving up, Probably for some frivolous little trinket. I doubt you'll ever amount to much in this dead-end job." His words stung, but Sarah swallowed her pride. "I enjoy my work, sir." Mark continued to belittle her, commenting on her appearance and making thinly veiled insults about her social standing. Other patrons began to notice the interaction, their conversations dying down as they observed the unsettling scene unfold. A sense of unease permeated the restaurant, the vibrant atmosphere slowly dissolving into a heavy silence. Sarah tried to ignore Mark's comments and focus on her duties, but his relentless harassment chipped away at her composure. Just as she poured his wine, a sudden tremor in her hand caused her to spill a few drops onto his hand. Mark erupted in a fit of rage. "You clumsy fool, are you trying to ruin my suit? Do you have any idea how much this cost?" He grabbed Sarah's wrist, his grip tight and painful. "I should have you fired right now. You're lucky I'm feeling generous tonight." Sarah's eyes welled up with tears, her voice trembling as she apologized profusely. "I'm so sorry, sir. It was an accident. I'll get you a cloth immediately." Mark sneered at her. "An accident? I think you're deliberately trying to provoke me. You people are all the same, lazy, incompetent, and disrespectful." He continued his tirade, his voice growing louder and more aggressive, drawing even more attention from the surrounding tables. People averted their gazes, pretending not to hear, but the air was thick with tension and discomfort. Sarah felt utterly humiliated, her face burning with shame. She longed to disappear, to escape the scrutiny and the venomous words that were tearing her down. She tried to pull away, but Mark held on tighter. "Let me go, sir. You're hurting me." The other customers remained silent, paralyzed by fear or apathy. They witnessed the abuse unfolding before their eyes, but they chose to look away, unwilling to intervene. The curse of silence hung heavy in the air, allowing Mark to continue his reign of terror unchecked. Unbeknownst to Mark, Clint Eastwood had entered the restaurant and was observing the scene from a discreet corner. His eyes narrowed, his face etched with concern. He recognized the predatory behavior, the blatant abuse of power. He had seen it countless times before, both on and off the screen. Tears streamed down Sarah's face as she finally managed to wrench her wrist free from Mark's grasp. She mumbled an apology and fled to the back of the restaurant, seeking refuge in the dimly lit storage room. Inside, she collapsed against a stack of boxes, sobbing uncontrollably. The pent-up emotions she had been suppressing for so long finally erupted in a torrent of grief. She thought about her dreams, about the sacrifices she had made to pursue them, and about the unfairness of life. She pictured her small bakery, the aroma of freshly baked bread filling the air, the smiles on the faces of her customers. But those dreams seemed impossibly distant now, overshadowed by the harsh reality of her present circumstances. She remembered her mother's words of encouragement, her unwavering belief in Sarah's potential. But even those words couldn't penetrate the cloud of despair that had enveloped her. Outside the storage room, Clint Eastwood stood silently, listening to Sarah's muffled sobs. He recognized the sound of broken dreams, the pain of injustice. He was reminded of his own struggles, the obstacles he had overcome to achieve his success. He remembered the times he had stood up for what was right, and the times he had remained silent, regretting his inaction later. He knew that Sarah needed help, but he also knew that intervention could be complicated. He wrestled with his conscience, weighing the risks and the potential consequences of his actions. Clint Eastwood leaned against the wall outside the storage room, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. His mind raced, analyzing the dynamics of the scene he had witnessed. He wasn't a man who readily interfered in the affairs of others, preferring to observe from a distance. However, the blatant cruelty he had seen inflicted upon Sarah had stirred something within him, a deep-seated sense of justice that couldn't be ignored. He knew the potential repercussions of getting involved. He was a public figure, and his actions would be scrutinized by the media and the public. He could be accused of grandstanding, of using his celebrity status to intimidate a private citizen. But could he really stand by and allow this young woman to be subjected to such abuse? Memories flickered through his mind, moments in his own life when he had chosen silence, when he had prioritized his own comfort over the well-being of others. He recalled a time when he had witnessed a similar act of bullying, but had hesitated to intervene, fearing the consequences. He had lived with the regret of that inaction for years, the memory haunting him whenever he saw injustice unfold. He knew that sometimes, the right thing to do was the hardest thing to do. After a moment of deep contemplation, Clint straightened his back, a newfound resolve hardening his gaze. He inhaled deeply, filling his lungs with the crisp ocean air, and made his decision. He would not remain silent. He would not allow this young woman to be victimized any longer. He would use his voice, his presence, to put an end to this injustice. Sarah, her eyes red and swollen, wiped her face with the back of her hand, attempting to regain some semblance of composure. She couldn't afford to lose her job. She needed the money to pay her rent, to keep her dreams alive. She took a deep breath, straightened her uniform, and prepared to face Mark again. As she emerged from the storage room, she saw Clint Eastwood walking towards Mark's table. Her heart skipped a beat. She knew who he was, of course, a legendary actor, a symbol of strength and integrity. What was he doing? Clint approached Mark's table with a slow, deliberate stride, his posture conveying an air of quiet authority. The restaurant fell silent once again, all eyes fixed on the unfolding drama. The clinking of glasses, the murmur of conversations, all ceased, replaced by an expectant hush. Even Mark, who had been basking in his perceived power, seemed taken aback by Clint's unexpected arrival. He looked up at Clint, a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. Clint stopped beside Mark's table, his gaze fixed on the man's face. His presence filled the space, casting a long shadow over Mark's arrogance. The air crackled with unspoken tension, a silent battle of wills about to commence. Sarah watched from a distance, her breath held captive in her chest. She had no idea what Clint intended to do, but she felt a surge of hope, a glimmer of light in the darkness. For the first time that evening, she felt like someone was finally on her side. Clint Eastwood spoke, his voice low and gravelly, but carrying with it an undeniable weight of authority. "Sir," he began, his words measured and precise, "I couldn't help but overhear your conversation with this young woman. I believe an apology is in order." Mark scoffed, his bravado returning. "And who are you to tell me what to do? Old man? This is none of your business." Clint's eyes narrowed slightly, but his voice remained calm. It becomes my business when I witness someone being treated with disrespect and cruelty. This young woman is working hard to earn a living, and she deserves to be treated with courtesy and respect. Mark leaned back in his chair, his face contorted with disdain. Respect? She spilled wine on me. She's incompetent. She deserves what she gets. Clint's gaze hardened. Everyone makes mistakes. It's how we respond to those mistakes that defines our character. You have the opportunity to show some grace, some empathy. Take it. Mark bristled at the challenge. Are you threatening me? Clint simply stared at him, his silence more powerful than any threat. He didn't need to raise his voice. He didn't need to resort to intimidation. His presence alone was enough to make Mark uncomfortable, to force him to confront his own behavior. The restaurant held its breath, waiting to see what Mark would do. The power dynamic had shifted dramatically. Mark, who had been so confident and arrogant just moments before, now appeared flustered and uncertain. He realized that he was no longer in control of the situation. Clint Eastwood didn't reply directly to Mark's question. Instead, he shifted his gaze slightly, looking directly at Sarah, who stood frozen in place, watching the scene unfold. He then turned back to Mark, his eyes filled with a quiet understanding. You know, Clint began, his voice softer now, almost conversational. I once met a man who was very much like you. He had a lot of power, a lot of money, and he used it to belittle those he considered beneath him. He thought it made him strong, but in reality, it just made him lonely. Clint paused, allowing his words to sink in. One day, he lost everything, his money, his power, his reputation. He was left with nothing but himself. And he realized how empty his life had been. He had spent so much time trying to tear others down that he had never built anything of value himself. He continued. He told me that the greatest regret of his life was the way he had treated people. He said that true strength wasn't about dominance, but about compassion. It wasn't about belittling others, but about lifting them up. As Clint spoke, Mark's expression began to change. The arrogance slowly faded from his face, replaced by a flicker of something akin to shame. He shifted uncomfortably in his chair, avoiding Clint's gaze. He remembered his own past, the times he had felt insecure and vulnerable, the times he had lashed out at others to mask his own pain. He recognized a truth in Clint's words, a reflection of his own flawed character. He had used his wealth and status to intimidate others, to make himself feel superior. But deep down, he knew that it was a hollow victory. Mark hung his head, his shoulders slumping slightly. He avoided eye contact with both Clint and Sarah, his gaze fixed on the tablecloth. After a long, agonizing silence, he finally spoke, his voice barely a whisper. I'm sorry, he mumbled, the words sounding strained and unnatural. He looked up at Sarah, his eyes filled with a mixture of shame and regret. I was out of line. I had no right to treat you that way. His apology was far from perfect, but it was genuine. It was a begrudging admission of wrongdoing, a small step towards redemption. Sarah, surprised by Mark's sudden change of heart, felt a wave of conflicting emotions wash over her. Relief, disbelief, and a flicker of sympathy. She had expected him to double down on his insults, to become even more aggressive. But instead, he had apologized. The tension in the restaurant began to dissipate, replaced by a collective sigh of relief. People who had been too afraid to speak out earlier now offered Sarah words of encouragement and support. Clint Eastwood nodded slowly, acknowledging Mark's apology. Sometimes, he said, his voice gentle, the hardest thing to do is admit that you're wrong. But it's also the most important. A small smile touched Sarah's lips. She looked at Mark, her eyes filled with a mixture of forgiveness and understanding. Thank you, she said softly, just as the atmosphere began to relax. The restaurant manager rushed over, his face flushed with anger. Sir, I must ask you to leave the premises immediately, he said to Mark, his voice trembling with indignation. Your behavior has been unacceptable. We do not tolerate that kind of treatment towards our staff. Mark looked up at the manager, his expression resigned. He seemed prepared to accept his fate, to be banished from the restaurant in disgrace. But before the manager could escort him out, Sarah spoke up, her voice clear and resolute. No, she said, stepping forward. I don't want him to be kicked out. The manager looked at her in astonishment. But he was so rude to you. He was harassing you. Sarah nodded. I know, but I don't think throwing him out will solve anything. I don't want to serve him anymore. She looked directly at Mark, her eyes unwavering. I'll ask someone else to take care of your table, but I won't be serving you. Her words resonated with the other patrons, who began to applaud her display of courage and self-respect. They had witnessed her humiliation, her vulnerability, but they had also seen her strength, her resilience. Her decision not to seek revenge, but to assert her own boundaries, was a testament to her character. The manager, taken aback by Sarah's unexpected response, hesitated for a moment, then nodded in agreement. Very well, he said, if that's what you want. Mark, surprised by Sarah's compassion, remained silent, his face etched with a mixture of gratitude and humility. After the manager had left, Clint Eastwood pulled up a chair and sat down next to Sarah, his presence calming and reassuring. You handled that with grace and dignity, he said, his voice filled with admiration. It takes courage to stand up for yourself, especially when you're facing someone who seems more powerful than you. Sarah blushed, feeling a warmth spread through her chest. Thank you, she said. It was hard. But I knew I couldn't let him get away with it. Clint nodded. It's important to set boundaries, he said, to let people know what you're willing to tolerate and what you're not. And it's equally important to stand by those boundaries, even when it's difficult. He paused, his eyes filled with wisdom. Never let anyone diminish your worth. He added, you have value, you have talent, and you have the right to be treated with respect. He then shared some of his own experiences, recounting times when he had faced adversity and had to fight for his beliefs. He talked about the challenges of navigating Hollywood, the pressures of fame, and the importance of staying true to oneself. Sarah listened intently, absorbing his words like a sponge. She realized that even someone as successful and respected as Clint Eastwood had faced struggles and setbacks. It gave her hope, a sense that she too could overcome the obstacles in her path. As they talked, a connection formed between them, a bond of understanding and mutual respect. Clint saw in Sarah a spark of determination, a resilience that reminded him of his younger self. And Sarah saw in Clint a mentor, a wise and compassionate figure who could guide her on her journey. After a while, Clint Eastwood rose to leave, his departure unnoticed by most of the other patrons, who were now engrossed in their own conversations. He extended his hand to Sarah, his grip firm and warm. Take care of yourself, he said, and remember, you're stronger than you think. Sarah smiled, her eyes sparkling with newfound confidence. I will, she said. Thank you, Mr. Eastwood, for everything. Clint nodded, then turned and walked towards the exit, his silhouette fading into the twilight. As he stepped out into the night air, he felt a sense of satisfaction. He had done what he could to help a young woman in need, and he had left a positive impact on the restaurant and its patrons. The atmosphere in Mission Ranch had shifted. The tension had dissipated, replaced by a sense of camaraderie and hope. People were talking, laughing, and connecting with one another. They had witnessed a moment of injustice, but they had also seen a display of courage and compassion. They had been reminded of the importance of standing up for what is right, and of treating one another with respect. The events of the evening would linger in their memories, serving as a reminder that even small acts of kindness can make a big difference. As Clint Eastwood drove away, he couldn't help but smile. He was reminded of a line from one of his old movies, "Every man has to know his limitations." But tonight, he had pushed past his own limitations, and he had made the world a little bit brighter. Mark sat alone at his table, nursing his glass of wine. The events of the evening replayed in his mind, each moment a stinging reminder of his own poor behavior. He felt a profound sense of shame, a realization of how deeply he had wounded Sarah and how much he had embarrassed himself. He had always prided himself on his success, his wealth, his status, but tonight, he had seen those things stripped away, revealing the emptiness beneath. He had used his power to intimidate and belittle others, but in the process, he had only diminished himself. Clint Eastwood's words resonated within him, echoing his own regrets and insecurities. He knew that he needed to change, to become a better person, but he wasn't sure how to start. He thought about Sarah, her resilience, her grace in the face of his cruelty. He knew that he owed her an apology, a sincere and heartfelt expression of remorse. But he also knew that words alone wouldn't be enough to undo the damage he had caused. He had to demonstrate his commitment to change, to show her that he was capable of empathy and compassion. After much deliberation, Mark reached for a pen and a piece of paper. He began to write, pouring out his heart in a letter to Sarah, expressing his remorse for his actions and promising to do better. He knew that it was just a small gesture, but it was a start. He folded the letter carefully, sealed it in an envelope, and addressed it to Sarah at Mission Ranch. He hoped that she would read it, and that she would find it in her heart to forgive him. Sarah received Mark's letter the following day. Initially, she was hesitant to open it, fearing that it might contain more insults or excuses. But curiosity eventually got the better of her, and she carefully tore open the envelope. As she read Mark's words, her initial skepticism began to fade. He expressed genuine remorse for his behavior, acknowledging the pain he had caused her. He didn't try to justify his actions or minimize his wrongdoing. Instead, he took full responsibility for his mistakes and promised to learn from them. He wrote about Clint Eastwood's words, and how they had made him realize the emptiness of his own life. He spoke of his desire to change, to become a more compassionate and understanding person. Sarah was surprised by the sincerity of his letter. She had expected arrogance and defiance, but instead, she found humility and regret. A wave of empathy washed over her, a sense that even someone as flawed as Mark was capable of redemption. She thought about her own struggles, her own moments of weakness and imperfection. She realized that everyone makes mistakes, and that forgiveness is essential for healing and growth. After much consideration, Sarah decided to seek Mark out. She wanted to tell him that she had forgiven him, and that she believed in his ability to change. A year later, Mission Ranch Restaurant remained a haven of peace and warmth. Sarah, now a confident and empowered woman, had become a beloved member of the staff. She still dreamed of opening her own bakery, but she no longer felt burdened by fear and insecurity. She had learned to value herself, to set boundaries, and to stand up for what is right. The story of Clint Eastwood's intervention had spread throughout the community, inspiring others to act with courage and compassion. People were kinder to one another, more willing to help those in need. The restaurant had become a symbol of hope, a reminder that even small acts of kindness can make a big difference. One evening, Clint Eastwood returned to Mission Ranch, his presence once again electrifying the atmosphere. He spotted Sarah across the room, her face radiant with happiness. He smiled, a genuine expression of pride and affection. He watched as she greeted customers with warmth and enthusiasm, her spirit shining bright. As he was about to leave, Sarah approached him, her eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you," she said, her voice soft but sincere. "You changed my life." Clint smiled. "You changed your own life," he replied. "I just gave you a little nudge." He paused, then added, "The world needs more people like you, Sarah. People who are willing to stand up for what they believe in, and who are willing to forgive those who have wronged them." He nodded farewell, then stepped out into the night, leaving behind a legacy of courage, compassion, and hope. The legend of Clint Eastwood, and the quiet, yet powerful change he inspired, lived on in the heart of Mission Ranch.